Okay, in this video we're going to talk about production. And so production, we're going to find that production is the key to understanding costs. So we first have to understand production. And we're going to think about a production process. Okay, so in our production process, we have we have different things we can use. So first of all, we have natural resources, and this is going to look familiar. So we can use natural resources to make our good. So for example, I think in your textbook they give an example about pizza. So yeah, this would be the natural resources involved would be the physical place, the land where you're making this pizza, and it would also be all the resources that go into it. For example, the milk that turns into cheese, and the meat that turns into the pepperonis, and the veggies and that turn into themselves, and the wheat that turns into flour. All of that stuff would be under this natural resources. So this include land and also materials. Okay. So we also have labor, right? Need some workers. We have capital, and remember, as we said before, this is physical capital. Okay. So this is the machines. So for example, if you're producing somewhere, this is the actual physical location of where you're producing. No, sorry, this is the building, for example, and any machines that you're using. So for example, back into the case of the pizza place, this is the table and all the equipment in the kitchen and the actual building. Okay, all that kind of stuff. It's all under capital. You have technology. Technology, I'm gonna add on a little bit here from what we've done before, because it might be a little different than you're kind of thinking. So this is the process of producing the product. So a lot of you think of technology as being a machine, and it can be related to that. But when we use the word technology, we're talking about the process of producing the product. So some of it can be embodied in a machine. So for example, you could choose to mix you could choose to make the dough by hand, or you could choose to use a mixer, a professional kitchen mixer to mix the dough. So those are choices of technology because you're choosing which process to use to make it. Now, you may need a certain level of physical capital to use the more advanced techniques. So it may come with that, but still there might be, just like you could use one person to make the whole pizza, or you could use 3 or 4 people and each person just does one step. That's a technological choice because it's a choice about how to set up your production process. And then the final thing we need is entrepreneurship. So the entrepreneur is the person who makes the decisions, right? They're the person who runs the business. They create the business, they start it, they plan it, they design it, and then the ones that they end up setting it up, right? So those kind of skills are called entrepreneurship. This one is different than labor because it involves a little bit more of a creative process and in what it's doing. Okay, so then we can put these together into a function. So this function is here. The quantity depends on, you can think of this as the quantity depends on, I'm just going to call this first one N. They call it NR in your textbook, but I'm just going to call it N. L for labor, K for physical capital, and then we can use, they use a little t. I think before we used an A, but anyways, T and E. That's fine. We'll just do that. So this is your production function. So this shows if I put a certain amount of these in, I can get a certain amount of pizzas or whatever it might be out the other side. Okay, so it takes a certain amount of, if I put a certain amount of natural resources, a certain amount of labor, a certain amount of capital, using a certain technology, and I have an entrepreneur, I can then produce a certain number of pizzas. And if I put in more labor, I'll probably get more pizzas. Also, if I put in more capital, I'll probably get more pizzas. In this, what we're going to do next, we're going to kind of ignore the natural resources part in what we're going to do next. Now, we can then separate this into what happens in the short run. So in the short run, some variables are fixed. Okay, so for example, and others can vary, right? So some inputs, I'll call it some inputs are fixed while others vary. Okay, so let's think of some fixed ones. So in the short run, Let's say you might have your building, right? Your large equipment. If it involves some kind of retraining of your staff, your technology might even be fixed. Meaning, like, if you had to change it, you'd have to retrain all your staff and maybe buy different equipment. So those things might be fixed. That's just some examples of it. Okay, it's sort of case by case basis. And then other inputs are variable. Okay, so for example, your resources, the raw materials, let's call it. Okay, so for example, if you need more cheese for making your pizzas, then you can easily just buy more cheese, right? So that's variable. It can change quickly, even in the short run. Whereas if you need a bigger restaurant because your restaurant's too crowded, or a smaller restaurant because your restaurant's you're not using all the space, again, that's a long-term thing. It's not something you can change in a week or two. It's something that might take you 6 months or a year or even longer to do, depending on what kind of business you're in. Okay. To some extent, the labor is variable, especially if you have hourly employees, because if you have hourly employees in your production process, it's probably pretty easy to add extra workers. And also, workers can increase their hours in a certain week. They can cut their hours in a certain week. So the labor input is fairly variable, right? So there's just some examples of this. So anyways, we kind of separate these two parts. And we'll come back in a later video and we'll go through these a little bit more. But one thing I just want to add to this that we can see here is that because some inputs are fixed, so there's the fixed inputs leads to fixed costs, right? So these fixed costs, they don't vary with quantity in the short run. They don't change with the quantity in the short run. Okay, so some of these things, some examples of these then is going to be, for example, rent. Okay, so you're paying rent on a certain building, and you probably signed a contract to pay a certain amount of rent for a certain amount of time. And even if your business is really busy or not busy at all, you still got to pay the same amount of rent. Okay, so this one is an example. That's an example of a fixed cost because it's not going to really change. Many of the opportunity costs are the same thing. Okay, so you quit your job to start this business. And so at least in the short run, you're running this business, you can't get your job back, so you face that opportunity cost. Most of the cost of the equipment, right, is also equipment cost. Often you buy those, they make a payment and you're not going to replace them for a period of time. Sometimes you buy them on credit. So again, those are going to be some kind of a fixed input cost, whether it's opportunity cost or like a monthly payment. And then variable inputs lead to variable costs. And these ones do change with quantity in the short run. Okay? And so some examples of variable costs. Again, we're just sticking with this example. So if we're talking about the pizza example, the flour, the cheese, the veggies, and the wages. Okay, so because if you're super busy, you'll add some workers. If you're not busy at all, you might cut workers. So again, the wage is also going to vary quite a bit, right? So now we can then put these parts together. So now we can look at cost, a total cost. We can look at our total cost as being these in the short run, as being these two parts put together: the fixed cost plus the variable cost. And we can also look at that as the fixed cost plus the variable cost times Q, because it depends on the quantity. Okay, so in the next video, I'll come back and show, we'll make a simplification of our production function, and we'll show how the production then determines our costs.